All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are here to talk about an enforcement action that Eagle's Air Quality Division is taking against Levy. But one of the purposes for tonight is to talk a little bit more about the enforcement process as well. So this is going to be kind of an initial meeting before we have another informational session and a hearing later on in October. So just want to set the stage there. I'm going to talk a little bit slowly through some of these welcome slides just to make sure that we give folks who want to join ample time to join in tonight and hear all the great information that folks will hopefully be sharing. So a few little housekeeping things before we get into the meat of the evening. We are going to be muting your lines during the meeting, except for when we're getting to our question and answer portions, and I will go over those in just a minute. And then we are going to be recording this. So if you have to jump off early, for folks that might have come in late, or if you know of anyone who is interested in learning more about this, but wasn't able to attend tonight, it's definitely going to be something that you'll be able to pass on. So how are things going to work? I just want to go over this because it's going to be a little bit different than how we normally do our air quality permitting meetings or our air quality enforcement meetings, if you've been to some of those before. So one of the things that we've heard from some of our stakeholders is that the enforcement process, because we don't do a lot of these enforcement meetings, can be a little bit less well known. So we wanted to have an opportunity to talk more about what the process actually is so people can maybe get a better understanding of how we got to where we are tonight with this facility, and maybe ask some questions along the way about how certain things work, certain portions of the draft enforcement consent order, so that we can just get a little bit better idea and maybe have a little bit more of a conversation and a little bit more of a give and take tonight. So I'm going to introduce them in just a few minutes, but we've got some air quality division staff online with us tonight. We have some of our field staff, inspectors, those folks that are responding to complaints and things like that. And then we also have enforcement staff person here. So we're going to go through a little bit of the process, and then we're going to pause at a couple times during the presentation to see if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask, or if we have any questions coming in the question and answer box that we can get to, kind of referring back to what we had just talked about, just to have those touch points along the way. And then once we get through the presentation itself, we'll do kind of more of a collective question and answer. So I just wanted to go over that briefly, and you'll hear me talk about it again in a couple minutes as well. So feel free to use that question and answer box at the bottom of your screen anytime. You can definitely type your questions in during the presentation tonight. You can click the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen when we have those pauses for question and answer, or when we get to the end of the presentation. And we'll try to unmute your line so you can ask your question. If we have folks calling in, which I don't think we do at the moment, but if we do, and I'll remind people, once we get to those Q&As, you can type #2 into the phone, and that will virtually raise your hand so that we know how to, not how to, that you'd like to ask a question, we can unmute your line. So right now I'm going to have all my panelists and staff folks turn their cameras on just so we can do a little bit of an introduction before we get started. I'll introduce myself first. I apologize for that. I always forget to do this. My name's Jennifer Dixon, and I do work in the Air Quality Division. And then tonight you're going to be mostly hearing from Erin Moran, and she is our enforcement specialist on this case. And then I have two staff people that are on with us tonight, Katie Koester and John Lamb. So you'll be hearing from Katie quite a bit, and then we've got John on to answer any questions that Katie might not be able to answer, and they might kind of tag team a little bit on that. And then Caitlin's being a little bit camera shy, but she's going to be helping me on the back end. She's in our environmental support division. So we're going to be tag teaming a little bit on the Q&A and stuff like that. She's going to be popping some links into the chat for you tonight as well, so that you can pull up these enforcement documents if you want to look at them alongside with listening to us, if there's anything you want to refer to, stuff like that. So thank you, staff. Appreciate it. John, if you want to turn your camera off, feel free to do that. But Erin and Katie, if you want to leave yours on, because we're going to be getting right into the presentation here. So like I said, we're going to do this information session. We're going to do the presentation on the proposed enforcement action, but we are going to be digging a little deeper into that process. And again, taking those breaks At the end, we're going to do a question and answer session. We're going to talk to you about how to submit an official comment. We're not going to be doing a hearing tonight. So just as a reminder, this is not a hearing. The hearing will be later on in October. We hope you'll come to that as well if you'd like to. Otherwise, we'll talk about ways that you can submit a comment without coming to the hearing, because you certainly don't need to come to a hearing to submit comments to us on this. We're going to talk about where you can go to get other information about this process, and then we'll give you contact information for Katie, Aaron, and John in case you want to get a hold of them, as well as our pollution emergency alert system number in case folks don't have it and would like to use it. So that being said, Aaron, I'm going to pass it over to you and Katie to go through the presentation. When you get to those question slides, we'll just take a pause and then we'll see if we have any questions. Sound good?
Sounds good. Thanks, Jen.
All right, go ahead.
As Jen said, I'm Erin. I work in the enforcement unit and the air quality division. I just want to say thanks to everyone for taking time out of your evening to come learn about this enforcement action against Levy. So to start out, I'm going to give a quick overview of the air quality division. And then Katie and I will talk about Levy's violations, the enforcement process, and then the proposed consent order that we currently have out for public comment. So the AQD, our air quality division, regulates sources of air pollutants to protect human health and the environment by enforcing air quality and health-based rules and regulations. So we specifically regulate stationary industrial sources, which we also call regulated facilities. So facility is the word you'll probably hear us use when we're talking about like a company or place that creates any air pollution emissions. So the AQD has many different roles in regulating air quality, and one of our primary roles is to conduct inspections of the regulated facilities to make sure that they are following the air quality and health-based rules and regulations during their operations. Okay, so this enforcement action covers violations at 2 different Levy facilities that, although one has a Dearborn address and one has a Detroit address, they are a little less than a mile apart. So the picture on the screen here is just kind of further out view of where Levy is located. If you're not familiar with the area, you can see like Zug Island and the Detroit River to the east, as well as where I-94 and I-75 are located around the facility. And then my second picture here, this zooms us up in a bit for a closer view of the facility, so you can see the locations of the 2 different facilities. So both Levy facilities do operate on Cleveland Cliffs property. Cleveland Cliffs is a company that makes iron and steel. So the Plant 6 facility, that is the one on the bottom and a little bit left in the picture in that yellow oval. That facility is on Mellon Street. It's near the intersection of Mellon and Schaefer. This plant handles slag that is formed while Cleveland Cliffs makes steel. And it was at this facility, the Plant 6 facility, where we cited the 21 days of follow-up violations that are included in this consent order. There's also the Section 2 facility, which is kind of the top right oval in this picture. It's located near the intersection of Dix and Miller Roads. This facility handles slag that is formed while Cleveland Cliffs makes iron. And this facility is where we cited 7 days of odor violations that are included in the consent order. So we're going to talk more about these violations in a bit later in the presentation. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Katie to talk more about Levy's process.
Okay, good evening. Katie Koester again from the Detroit District Office. First of all, just wanted to give you a little background about Levy operations. As we mentioned, Levy handles slag that's produced by Cleveland Cliffs in Dearborn. And there are essentially 2 main types of slag that Aaron mentioned, iron slag and steel slag. But the process for handling both types of slag is generally the same. There are some differences which we will point out during the presentation. So again, slag is formed when making iron and steel. Basically, it floats on top of the metal and then it's collected into a pot. Where Levy comes in is they collect that pot and move it to a pit. At the pit, the molten slag is slowly dumped out of the pot. You can see that pictured here. And once the pit is full, the slag is air and water cooled for a period of time. So after saturating the slag with water, they dig out the slag from the pits and stockpile it. And then further watering occurs at the stockpile until it's either loaded into trucks. This is what happens at the Section 2 site, or it's further processed by screening it into different sizes on Mellon Street. And this happens in the Plant 6 process. Another difference that we wanted to point out for Plant 6 is that the empty slag pot is brought to a partial enclosure, which you can see in the red building that's pictured there. And the pot is turned upside down and knocked against a hard surface to dislodge any material that has solidified in the pot. That's known as the skull. Also at Section 2, there is an odor control chemical that is added to the water sprays to control for sulfur odors, and that is not added at the Plant 6 operation. So what is in the slag really depends on the raw materials that are used at the steel mill, but in general, it's mostly calcium oxide and iron oxide. It can also include silicon, aluminum, and magnesium oxides, and then a small percentage of sulfur. The high calcium is due to the high amount of lime and limestone that's used in the process. All right, so to set the context of the enforcement action, let's just go over the air quality violations. So first, the state of Michigan has a rule, some of you might be familiar with it, Rule 901B, that says that a company shall not have air emissions that cause unreasonable interference with the comfortable enjoyment of life and property. So this is the rule we use, which covers both odors and fallout. Just to note that throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the word fallout, but really I'm including any fugitive dust or debris that leaves the facility's property lines. So the violations that we cited the Levy Company for were all for Rule 901B. And they were all the result of AQD district staff, either myself or John Lamb, investigating citizen complaints. And the investigations of the fallout complaints led us to allege that the fallout was coming from Plant 6. And then our investigations of the odor complaints led us to allege that odors were coming from the Section 2 facility. And then due to the continued noncompliance, we were documenting with Rule 901. The violations from both facilities were referred to escalated enforcement. Now, just as an aside on how AQD conducts these complaint investigations and cites violations, because some of you might not be familiar with our process. For fallout, we're going to get a complaint, go to the location and observe the fallout. Typically, we take a sample. We send it to a lab to analyze the sample. And in this case, also to compare the sample to reference samples of material that we have from the Levy Company. We're also going to note the wind direction during the time frame of the incident and whether the complainant was downwind of the source, and also evaluate how close the fallout location is to the potential source. So of all these things lining up, you know, that there was an adequate amount of fallout, we took a sample, the lab analysis matches it to a potential source, and the wind direction correlates with the complainant being downwind of the source, then we typically issue a violation notice for fallout. As it relates to odors, we're going to conduct surveillance in the area of the complaint. And if we smell the odor, we're going to determine if it's similar to any nearby industrial sources. And then we're going to evaluate that odor on a scale of 0 to 5. We also drive around and know where the odor is present, how long it lasts, and how frequently we're detecting it. And again, we're evaluating whether the area of the complaint is downwind of a suspected industrial source. And then we travel upwind of that source to confirm that the odor is no longer present. So if all of those things line up, then we will be issuing a citation for Rule 901 as it relates to odors.
Okay, so now we're going to go over the enforcement process a bit, as Jen said at the beginning, just to maybe give folks a bit more context about how this process plays out. So this slide includes a visual overview of the enforcement process. So before we even get to escalated enforcement, there is a process that we follow to address air quality violations. So this process starts with the inspection of a facility. It can include a physical inspection where an inspector is checking the facility's operations to make sure that they are operating both according to their permit and also according to any state and federal air quality regulations that may apply to the facility. As Katie mentioned, we also inspect facilities in response to complaints for issues such as odors, fallout, and fugitive dust. And during these inspections, we conduct investigations like the way Katie explained in the last slide. So during these inspections, we may find violations. If we find a violation, then we send what's called a violation notice. This is sort of an official notice that we send to the company that says, we found a violation at your facility, you need to address it and let us know how you're going to address it and when you're going to address it. So the company does have time to respond to the violation notice and to be able to correct the violations. So in this case with Levy, we inspected and found the violations due to receiving the odor and fallout complaints. So after a period of time, if the violations are not being resolved, if they're recurring, or if they might be in a category of violations that are required to be sent to enforcement, the district staff then sends an enforcement referral to us in the enforcement unit. So after we receive that referral, the enforcement unit, so that's me and some of my coworkers, we will send an enforcement notice to the company. So this enforcement notice lets the company know that they will have to resolve their violations through a legal process. This is usually through a document called a consent order, which I'll describe in the next slide. But the enforcement notice requests an initial meeting with the company so we can start discussing the enforcement process and how they're going to resolve their violations. So after this first meeting, we may have a few, or we may have many subsequent meetings with the company about, what the plan is going to be to resolve the violations. It's during this time period when we are coming up with a compliance plan that the company will have to follow to resolve the violations. So once we reach an agreement on this plan, we then post the proposed consent order for a 30-day public notice and comment period. So that's where we are right now in the process. And so this is a time period where people can submit comments about the proposed consent order that we will take into consideration. In this case for Levy, we are also holding a public hearing as part of the public comment period. So after this public notice and comment period is over, AQD will address all substantive comments that we receive. So if there is demand from the public on an item in the consent order that AQD is able to change, we may go back to the company and propose changes to the consent order. If there are no changes, or we are proposing changes to the consent order and the company agrees with them, then we move forward and both the company and AQD sign the consent order. And it's at this point where the consent order is what we call it is effective, and the company is legally required to follow what is in the consent order. So escalated enforcement It's not a term you hear every day, so what does that mean? Escalated enforcement is a legal process which we use to resolve air quality violations that were cited and sent to enforcement. The end result of the enforcement process is usually an administrative consent order. So this is a legally binding contract between AQD and a company. Most violations that are escalated to enforcement are resolved through a consent order. So a consent order is also an administrative settlement. We are legally required to offer a settlement to a company in enforcement before we consider sending the case further to the Department of Attorney General or to the Environmental Protection Agency for them to resolve. A consent order always contains a compliance plan, payment of a monetary fine, and what are called stipulated fines in the case that there are violations of the consent order. So in this slide, I just wanted to give some examples of when enforcement can happen. Excuse me. So our district staff are really key to an enforcement case. They're the ones who are checking on a facility to make sure that they are in compliance with any permits they have, and also with the air quality rules and regulations that are applicable to that facility. So there are many scenarios in which enforcement can happen. I've listed some examples here on the slide. So first, as we described earlier, our district staff can observe violations during inspections and by responding to complaints. Next on the list, there can also be violations of stack testing. So this is like, for example, if a company tests the level of pollutants coming out of their facility and the test results show that they are over the amount that is allowed in their permit, they could end up in enforcement. Monitoring, record keeping, and reporting are also really important in our permitting program and for air quality. So an example here would be like a company might be required to make sure an engine they have is properly operating. They might have to keep records of how often they inspect that engine, and then they might have to report that information to AQD. So if we find that they aren't doing this correctly and they don't correct it when we send them a violation notice, this might be when they would end up in escalated enforcement. There are also the case of violations of state and federal rules and regulations. So this case with Levy is a good example. They weren't complying with Rule 901B. Also, failing to meet permit requirements can land a company in escalated enforcement. So some of the examples I gave before, such as pollutant limits in their permit, monitoring and record keeping requirements, these are things that can be written into a company's permit, and if they don't operate according to their permit, they can end up in enforcement. Also, failing to meet deadlines to come into compliance. So, for example, occasionally air quality rules and regulations change and are updated. A change in a regulation may require a company to maybe install a certain piece of equipment by a certain deadline. If they don't do this, then that means they aren't complying with that regulation, and they could end up in enforcement for that. So, I gave a lot of examples here, and there are a lot of ways a company can end up in enforcement, but that said, most of the violations we cite are resolved at the district level and don't require escalated enforcement. So now I think I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and we're going to take a pause for any questions.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Katie. So we threw a lot of information at everyone. Caitlin has shared some information in the chat. I think I put chat and shared together in my head there for a second. She's shared a couple links in the chat. Those will point you to our enforcement webpage, and then also to the draft documents for Levy, which we're here to talk about tonight. So I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now, but if anyone wants to ask a question about what we just talked about, we're going to dig a little deeper into things. So we gave you this, high level And then in the next few slides, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the specifics that we are dealing with this levy enforcement action. So if anyone has any questions about the enforcement process, how we got here, the violation notices, anything that we've talked about thus far, I'll give you just a minute or so, just in case people are typing, but you can also raise your hand. Like I said, I'm just going to check really quick to make sure I'm not misspeaking. We don't have anybody calling in right now, but folks that call in would also be able to verbally ask a question if they had them. So we can ask them now, or we can definitely answer any questions about this section when we get to the end of the presentation too. I don't want to rush anybody, but want to make sure that if there was something that didn't make sense that we already talked about, we kind of handle it as we go along, since we're going to be building a bit on that information for sure. So I'm just going to give you another couple seconds here just to make sure nobody's in the midst of typing, and then I will pass it back to move on. So just give you a couple seconds here. All right. Well, I'm going to pass it back to you, Erin. So I know you're on this slide. You've got some things to walk us through from the timeline perspective, so I'll pass it right back to you.
Yep, thanks. All right, so moving on to talk more about what's happening in this levy enforcement action. A lot has happened in this case over a long period of time, so I wanted to give a visual overview of the timeline for this enforcement action. So the timeline here starts in September of 2018, which was when we cited the earliest violations that we are resolving in the consent order. The timeline then goes until October of 2024, which is when the public notice and comment period for the proposed enforcement action will end. So you can see on the timeline that the length of the time period we cited for odor violations is pretty different from the time period that we cited for the fallout violations. So as I said, the earliest violations we cited were fallout violations from Plant 6 that occurred in September of 2018. So between September 2018 and May 2024 is when we cited those 21 days of fallout violations I mentioned a bit earlier in the presentation. So this time period is represented by this large light blue box with a dashed outline that's covering a big portion of the timeline. The time period in which we cited odor violations from the Section 2 facility is a bit shorter, lasting from November 2019 to September 2021. And this time period is shown as this light gray box with a dotted line. So in the middle of the timeline, there are two circles that show when we sent the enforcement notices to the two facilities. So the circle on the left shows that we sent an enforcement notice to Levy for their odor violations at the Section 2 facility in March of 2022. And after a period of about 6 months, in September 2022, we decided to escalate the fallout violations also. And so at this point, we sent another enforcement notice to Levy for violations at the Plant 6 facility, which is shown on the circle on the right. So on the right side of the timeline, you can see two circles that show today's informational session and also for the public hearing that we will be holding on October 15th. There's also that darker gray box, which represents the public notice and comment period, which we opened on September 9th and will last until the end of the day on October 25th. You can also see that there's like a gap between when we sent the enforcement notices and the public notice and comment period. This shows how long it can sometimes take to reach a resolution with a company and enforcement. A lot of cases move more quickly, but as you can see, some enforcement cases can take quite a while to reach a resolution with the company. And it's pretty normal for us to have a length of time like this before we can reach a resolution. So next up is a summary of what is written in the proposed consent order. So the consent order identifies the alleged violations that will be resolved, In this case, the Rule 901B, odor and fallout violations. It has a compliance plan that Levy will be required to follow, which we will go over in the next few slides. It also includes a monetary fine. So in this settlement, the total amount that Levy will be required to pay adds up to $388,703. As in every enforcement case, a portion of this is required to go to the State of Michigan General Fund. The amount in this case is $33,750. The rest of the fine, so that is $354,953 will go to a supplemental environmental project that Levy is proposing to do as part of this enforcement action. Lastly, the consent order also includes stipulated fines that Levy may have to pay in the case that we find violations of the consent order after it is signed. So in the next few slides, Katie and I are going to give a summary of Levy's proposed compliance plan. So just as an overview, in the compliance plan, Levy will be required to comply with Rule 901. So they shouldn't be causing odors or fallout that interfere with people's lives. They are also going to be required to comply with both a fugitive dust control plan and a nuisance minimization plan for odors, both of which AQD has reviewed and approved. So now I'm going to hand the slides over to Katie so she can tell you a bit more about these two plans.
All right, so let's start with the fugitive dust control plan. So this plan applies to Plan 6, again, operations on Mellon Street and near the intersection of Mellon and Schaefer. And it's a document that describes what actions the facility is going to take to minimize fugitive dust that could cause fallout in the surrounding area. So the plan incorporates kind of a mix of requirements. It has, existing requirements that are already in the permit, but now they have an associated fine for noncompliance, as well as enhanced and new requirements that were identified and agreed upon as part of this action. All right, so what are the requirements? First, the facility is going to continue to water the slag thoroughly. That's an existing requirement, but now would have an associated fine for noncompliance. They're going to maintain and operate additional sprays, which are located along the south side of the property to manage dust from slag. This is new. They're going to properly operate and maintain the partial enclosure, that's the red building that I was talking about earlier, with a water misting system. Now that's been in place, so that's an existing requirement, but we've enhanced the requirements through this order by now specifying the minimum number of misters that must be in place and used when they're using the enclosure. And as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a picture of a mister. It's not a mister that is on site at Plant 6, but I just wanted to show an example of the type of equipment we're talking about. All right, next, the plan specifies that only certain operations can be carried out within this enclosure. So that is an existing and a new requirement because the facility was always required to knock the slag pots that I was talking about earlier in the enclosure, but now they're also conducting an additional operation in the enclosure with the misting as opposed to just in the open air. So that would be a new requirement. They're going to regrade the ground around the slag pits to minimize the chance of standing water. Standing water is not good to have in areas of hot slag. It can react and cause fallout. So this is a new requirement. And there's also a process change that relates to one type of steel slag that they handle, which is known as caster slag. So it's now through this draft order, mostly going to be mostly handled inside of a building on the Cleveland Cliffs property instead of dumped in a pit, open air pit outside of Plant 6. So that is another new control that is a part of this proposed fugitive dust plan. So how are we going to ensure that the company is following the order and using all of these controls? Well, first, they're going to have to inspect the controls every day and document that they're working properly. This is part of the proposed plan. We've required employee training so that to occur yearly so that everyone is on the same page about what the requirements are. The facility is going to conduct quarterly maintenance, mostly on the misters that I was talking about in the previous slide. And the reason for this is just to try to prevent any breakdowns of the equipment. And also they're required to have spare parts on hand to quickly address any potential equipment issues. Again, all of these things are required to be documented, and along with any issues that might be noted during these daily inspections and any corrective actions that the company takes. AQD will also conduct inspections over the course of this proposed order and evaluate compliance with the plans while we're out during our normal inspection process. Lastly, on this slide, I just wanted to mention that Levy will also continue their existing program of sweeping and applying dust suppressant on unpaved roads. That is an actual picture from inside the facility. And other vehicle areas inside the plant. And also will continue use of water sprays on the screening equipment. At this time, these two activities don't seem like they're the likely source of creating fallout complaints in the neighborhood, but regardless, it's now, it is a fugitive dust control measure. It's in the plan, and again, would be subject to a fine if the company doesn't comply. So that is a high-level overview of the plan. Again, it's a draft plan, and so it is open to comment from the public during this time. So I think we're going to pause here for some questions.
Yeah, we're going to pause because thank you so much for walking us through that, Katie. So there's kind of like these three elements that are, a big part of this consent order. What Katie just talked about, the fugitive dust plan. We're going to talk in a slide or two about the nuisance minimization plan for odors. And then we're going to talk about the supplemental environmental projects. So because these are all like pretty detailed things, we wanted to talk about them in part and just pause for questions if anyone had any on, what we just talked about. Again, we'll have that time at the end of the presentation to go over questions as well. But if folks had any questions about this part now, and Katie, you just hit on a really good point that I think a lot of times people don't really understand about our enforcement process is these plans are open for comment as well. They're part of the consent order. It doesn't mean that if they were approved as they are right now, and the consent order went forward, that these plans could never change. So part of Katie's job and John's job as well is when we're addressing these plans, if we go out and we find that one of the things that's in the plan really just isn't working, those plans can also be modified to address any future issues as well. So they're a really important part of these consent orders, and it's nice to have something that's like a robust plan like that instead of just having, that monetary fine. So wanted to make sure nobody had any questions specific to the fugitive dust plan before we have Katie talk about that nuisance minimization plan for odors. And I always say I wish it was called something else because I stumble over it every single time. We also abbreviate that. One of the other things that I wanted to just mention, Katie and Aaron talk a lot about, and you might hear them saying the AQD, that's us collectively, our little part of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. So just so that we'll say Air Quality Division or the AQD kind of interchangeably. So I'm not seeing any questions. I wanted to dilly-dally there a minute in case someone was typing. But I'm going to pass it back to you, Katie. And then if you want to talk a little bit about that nuisance minimization plan for odors, and then we'll take another pause in case people have questions on this one, before we move on.
Okay, one thing you reminded me that I forgot to mention, in both of these plans is that once they're in effect, there is a requirement that the facility also has to report to us on a quarterly basis, their compliance with the plans and whether they, failed to meet any of the requirements in the plan. So those are reports we're gonna be getting quarterly and reviewing as well. So now I'm going to move to the
I think you
nuisance.
just passed it. No,
Sorry.
no, you're all right. We're on this one. We're just learning how to use this whole, like, we can all share the slideshow without having to do it. So this is our first time. Thank you for bearing with us on that. So Katie, I think I have you in the right place. So go
Yeah.
ahead whenever you
Okay.
want. You're fine.
Sorry about that. Okay.
No, you're fine.
So now we're going to shift gears, but talk about nuisance minimization plan. There are a lot of similarities though. But anyway, this is a plan for odors. It applies to the Section 2 facility. So that's the facility operating near Miller and Dix. And again, this is a similar type document. It outlines the process and operational requirements that Levy must follow in order to minimize odors. So again, this plan incorporates a mix of elements. It's got existing requirements that are in the permit, but now we have an associated fine for noncompliance. It has enhanced requirements. What I mean by that is maybe it did exist in the permit, but we've fleshed it out and made it more specific and enforceable. And then there are some new requirements that were identified and agreed upon as part of this action. So as I mentioned, I think earlier on at the beginning of the presentation, the iron making slag process has the potential to create odors due to the sulfur content. So it has an odor control system. The requirements that are in this plan are, first of all, to continue to water the slag and use the odor control. This is an existing requirement, now subject to a fine if it's not in place. The next requirement is to ensure the odor control system is properly operated and maintained. So the company was already required to have an odor control system, but the wording of the requirement was very vague. So what we did through this order is, first of all, the system has been improved and there were some upgrades made. And then we included specific requirements in this plan on how the system is going to operate properly. That didn't exist before. And so now we have a more clear procedure and documentation for what it means to have the system working at a level that is expected. So potassium permanganate is the chemical that's added to the water to control odors. And the company did increase the amount of permanganate that they're using to the maximum amount that will dissolve in water. So proper operation of the system in this plan includes one, adding the maximum amount of permanganate per day and keeping a record of the additions. Also inspecting the tank that is mixing and holds the permanganate to ensure there's no leaks. That's a daily inspection, if I didn't say that already. 3, there will be daily checks of the pumps, the mixers, and the water sprays to ensure the whole system is working properly. The facility is also required to have a 1-week supply of permanganate on hand. So how are we going to ensure that the company is following the requirements in the plan? So the plan requires a daily inspection of the odor control system and documentation that it's working properly. One very helpful thing about permanganate is that it is a purple color, so one can quickly assess whether there's a potential issue or not. So it turns the water purple is what I'm saying. So you can quickly look at the water sprays and see if there's an issue. The facility is also required to conduct a daily on-site odor survey, driving around the facility to look for, or I guess smell for anything abnormal. Again, we have the employee training on a yearly basis to make sure everyone's on board and aware of all the requirements in the order. The company has to conduct regular maintenance to make sure that the equipment is working properly, try to prevent any breakdowns, and have spare parts on hand to quickly address any equipment issues. Again, all of these items are required to be documented along with any issues that are noted and corrective actions taken. And similar to the fugitive dust plan, AQD will also conduct inspections and evaluate compliance with this plan during our inspection process. Again, this is a draft plan open to comment from the public. And then once it's finalized through the order, as Jennifer mentioned, is what's kind of known as a living document. It could be modified if there are any deficiencies or changes that are noted and needed. And finally, once it's finalized, as I mentioned with the dust plan, there is a requirement to report quarterly to the agency on whether all of the components of the plan are being met. And all of these things are subject to a stipulated penalty if they are not complied with.
All right, thanks, Katie, for walking us through that one. Another kind of complicated plan for sure. Oop, stop clicking, Jennifer. We got it. Just wanted to pause again. Again, that's another complicated plan with a lot of different details that Katie talked through. Want to make sure that folks have the understanding that they want on that. Again, Caitlin had shared links to get to the actual plans in the chat or a little bit earlier tonight. So if you wanted to click on those, we didn't know if someone might want to follow along or had specific questions about certain aspects of it. So we want to just make sure that we again took that little pause to make sure that there wasn't any specific questions about what Katie just talked about. We're going to talk about the supplemental environmental project next. And then after that, we'll get to kind of that more broad question and answer period. So if folks don't have any questions right now, that's totally fine. We can move forward into that supplemental environmental project conversation, and then we'll move on to questions. So I think, Erin, you're talking about this one. Am I right on that?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, go ahead whenever you're ready then.
Thanks. All right, so this is the last slide about the consent order, so you can, get your questions ready and stop hearing us blabbing. So a supplemental environmental project, which we call a SEP, because supplemental environmental project is kind of a tongue twister, is an environmental or public health project that a company volunteers to do as part of a consent order. So any SEP that a company proposes as part of the consent order must go above and beyond what the law requires and must provide added benefits to the community or environment affected by the violations. I think it's important to know that AQD is not allowed to require a company to do a SEP, and we can also not direct a company to do a certain SEP. That's part of our policy. So in this case, Levy's proposed SEP is a haul truck replacement project. So right now, one of the haul trucks they're using is from 1965 at the Plant 6 facility. As you can probably imagine, the emission standards in 1965 were not as strict as they are today. So this truck emits quite a bit of pollution. So Levy is proposing to replace the 1965 truck with a new haul truck that was built in 2024. So as you can also probably imagine, technology has come a long way since 1965, and truck emission standards are also much more strict. So compared to the 1965 truck, the 2024 truck will produce 99% less nitrogen oxide, particulate matter, and total hydrocarbon emissions. As part of this project, we're also requiring Levy to scrap that old 1965 truck. So it's going to be taken apart and will no longer be able to be used anywhere. So the total cost of this project, at minimum will be $354,953. Most of that is the cost of, that new truck. There's also a timeline in place that Levy will have to follow, for this SEP. So they'll be required to purchase, the new truck within 30 days of when the consent order is signed. The truck must be delivered and in service within 16 months of when the consent order is signed. That might seem like a long time, but this truck, I believe it will be delivered from overseas, so that can, extend that timeline. The existing 1965 truck must also be scrapped no later than 30 days after the new truck is in service. So if you're interested in reading more about the SEP, maybe you want more detail about the project, you can check out the enforcement summary report and proposed consent order. This is posted on our website and also in the links that Caitlin sent in the chat. We also have a link on the slide at the end of the presentation, and you'll have time to write that down if that's the path you want to go. So the SEP proposal is part of Levy's consent order that is posted. It is a pretty long document with both of the plans that we talked about and the SEP. So the SEP proposal starts on page 73. That's, you just want to directly get there. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'll hand it back over to Jen so we can start the question and answer session.
Yeah, thank you guys. Hey, John, if you want to turn your camera on, just in case we have any questions that folks have. I know Caitlin sent that SEP information link to Caitlin. Thanks for putting those links in the chat. That's really helpful. Hopefully people can copy and paste those wherever they may need them. As folks kind of get any questions that you might have, just refresher, you can use that raise hand icon and ask your question verbally. We're happy to take questions in that question and answer box. We will be doing a follow-up email to this evening's meeting. So because we're recording the meeting, we will send the meeting recording out. We'll send any of these links out in that email as well. We're hoping if you know folks who weren't here tonight that maybe wanted to, that you could pass that information forward. We have a little bit more outreach that we're going to do about this project before we get to that hearing on the 15th, but wanted to just make sure everybody had as much information as they could at their fingertips for the meeting tonight. So we'll give you guys a few minutes just to see if anybody wants to type any other information into the chat. But while you are thinking about that, once we get past the Q&A, there's a couple other things that we want to go over, mainly just how you can make a comment if you aren't able to attend the hearing on the 15th, a little bit more on where you can find some additional information if you're interested in that, and then how you can get a hold of our panelists if you have other questions about the draft proposal. We're happy to answer those. We don't have to answer them tonight. We're happy to answer those via email or on the phone or whatever. Or if there's any complaints or concerns that you have about these facilities or questions about the Detroit area, John and Katie are a wealth of knowledge about facilities in Wayne County. So really happy to have them be able to join us tonight because they do have a lot of that information. I certainly don't have that. So we'll give you just another minute here, see if there's any questions. And if not, we're happy to move on to a couple of those other things before we let you go. So we'll just give you another minute here just to make sure nobody is typing questions. I don't want to cut anybody off because I've done that on accident before, and I know that doesn't make people very happy for sure. All right, well, I'm not seeing that I have anyone calling in, so I think we're good there. Caitlin, and I'm not missing anything, that there's no questions in the question and answer box, correct?
You are correct, Jen. I do not see any in the question and answer box.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Caitlin. Okay, well, I guess we will go ahead and my panelists, if you guys want to turn your cameras off, I'll take it from here. We just have a couple more minutes. So thank you again for being willing to give this presentation and answer questions that folks have. Like I said, just a couple other things to round out the evening. One of the questions that we get a lot of times, especially on enforcement actions, because we don't have these kinds of meetings very often, is, about public comment. What kind of comment is a good comment? So I hope that you heard tonight that everything in the draft consent order is open for comment. So we encourage people to comment on anything in that draft order that they feel passionate about or that they feel might need to be changed or tweaked. There's definitely comments that are more likely to lead to changes than others. And so want to just mention a couple of those in case it's helpful for folks as you pull your comments together. So things that are focused on the content and the basis of the draft consent order, or comments requesting specific changes to be made, those are going to be things that are more likely to lead to changes. So you heard those draft plans are open for comment, things like that. So if you really want to dig in deep to this, that's definitely something that you could focus on if you wanted to. Comments that are least likely to lead to changes are things that might be outside the scope of the proposed consent order, or whether the community supports or doesn't support the proposal in general. So, but we do review all the comments no matter what they are, and they are considered by the decision maker before we would make a final decision on this consent order. So wanted to just talk a little bit about that. Like we mentioned, October 15th, we're going to do another informational session, a shorter one than this one, I promise. We wanted to give a lot more detail in this one, just about the process to hopefully help people understand, how we got to this night. But that'll be a little shortened version that you'll hear from Katie and Aaron again, just really briefly. And then we'll follow that with a public hearing. So that will be online as well. Folks are more than welcome to come to that as well, if they'd like to. So that will start at 6 p.m. Caitlin shared the link in the chat. So if you haven't registered and you're interested, or even if you think you might be interested, great idea to just register. If you don't want to, you can always just join at 6 o'clock on the 15th. That's not a problem either. I mentioned, the agenda for that will just be that short informational session. We will have the question and answer again in case people do have questions. Just wanted to mention that, apologize for missing that, and then followed immediately by the public hearing. So hopefully we'll see all of you guys there as well. So how can you make a comment? Let's say you want to, but you don't want to attend the hearing on the 15th. That's fine. That's a great place to make a comment. We'll be accepting verbal comments online that day. You can also email Aaron directly. A suggestion of putting levy enforcement notice or levy consent order, something about levy in the subject line so she knows, but she'll take your comment directly to her email. You can also mail in those comments to Eagle AQD PO Box 30260 in Lansing, Michigan. You can also leave us a voicemail. So more than happy to take your comment on voicemail as well. Just please mention your name, that you're calling about the levy consent order, and that phone number is 517-284, it should be, and not 584. I apologize, there was a typo in that, 284-0900. So definitely more than willing to take a voicemail. All this information can be found at michigan.gov/Eagle Air Public Notice. That's kind of your one-stop shop for anything related to public comment in our air quality division here at Eagle. That includes permits, enforcement actions, toxics, rules, pretty much anything that we take public comment on. That's going to be your place that you would want to start looking. So where can you find more information? Like I just mentioned, that michigan.gov/Eagle Air Public Notice is a great starting place. You're going to find that proposed enforcement summary. So that's a really high level overview of this enforcement case. It's going to just have, that very high level information. Digging deeper is going to be that enforcement summary report and the draft consent order. Like Aaron mentioned, that draft consent order and the associated plans and supplemental environmental projects is quite lengthy. So if you're having a hard time finding something in there that you're really looking for, we're happy to help you with that as well. A little bit about what happens next. So we're going to have that hearing on October 15th at 6. Once that is over and we're continuing to collect those comments, that public comment period will close on October 25th at midnight. On October 26th or shortly thereafter, we'll start looking through all of those comments that we've gotten. We will prepare a response to comments document. So we'll be responding to all those comments in a document called the response to comments document. We typically share that out with folks who attended any of the meetings or who we know might be interested in that. And then we'll finalize the consent order with or without changes. So just wanted to let folks know it's kind of what happens next. High level, we're definitely happy to answer questions on that as well. Here's how you can get a hold of Erin or Katie or John if you have any specific questions for them. Like I mentioned earlier, Erin is going to be our enforcement person on this case. Katie and John work there right out of our Detroit district office. They do inspections and respond to complaints related to these two levy facilities, as well as the variety of other industrial facilities that we have there in Wayne County. If you find you're having a concern with odors or fallout or any other complaint related things, you can always give a call to our pollution emergency number, which is there on the bottom of the screen, and that's 800-292-4706. So with that, I'm going to take a deep breath and thank everyone for joining us tonight. I know it's October 1st, but this last weekend has been so nice with the weather. And it turned out to be a great day here as well. So hopefully you'll have a few minutes to get outside if you'd like to. But other than that, like I mentioned, we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. So please feel free to reach out. And Caitlin, if you want to go ahead and end the meeting, you can do so. And thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time tonight.